This week, I've got Superman, and as a reminder, this will be a spoiler-free review. Now, this is our umpteenth iteration of Superman on screen, and I gotta say, I am not really a Superman person. I'm also not really a Captain America person because they are very similar to each other. They are these nigh invincible, never going to do anything but the right thing characters, and it makes sense, they came about in the Golden Age of comics. Superman is, sometimes the marker for the Golden Age of comics, which coincided with World War II. And so you have this very clear depiction of good versus evil, and these are the characters that are representing good. And so as we've evolved and gained more complex heroes, I have never really gravitated towards the very binary nature of the good-evil story. However, this Superman film, I think, is certainly my favorite of, especially any of the recent ones. I will exempt the Christopher Reeve one, though. That will always be the gold standard for me. And I think some of it is just, it's a good movie, and some of it is elevated by great release timing that really I don't think they could have predicted. Shout out to James Gunn there. This is his first mega foray in DC Comics. Obviously, he has dipped into the DC world before, but he's also been in the Marvel world, and now he is the head of DC's film, or co-head of DC's film, so this is his flagship thing, and picking Superman as your kind of tentpole, yeah, it makes sense. And I gotta say, tonally on screen, James Gunn is somebody who I enjoy his take on superheroes. I love Guardians of the Galaxy. Peacemaker, I think, is one of the funniest shows out there. The intro alone is absolutely worth it. I would pick that. We're going to exclude the Suicide Squad for a moment, but I would pick that over, say, like a gritty Batman, because I enjoy comedy. And so James Gunn's Superman is, of course, going to have a lot of that signature comedy and some of the zaniness, and you can tell in like a lot of the timing, but he is also clearly approaching this with an earnestness that I do think belongs on Superman. Nobody wants a snarky, snappy Superman. That's just not who the character is. And I think if you diverge too far from that, people would be in an uproar. And even I would be like, well, that's just not Superman. That's a different superhero. Why are you bothering to call this that? So anyway, James Gunn's signature, definitely all over this. I think this film succeeds more in the comedic moments. It's trying in the earnest moments. I don't think they're terrible, but I do think that those are the moments, for me at least, that I gravitate towards. Those in the action scenes, so we've got a new Superman in the form of David Cornsweet. I think he does a lovely job. I don't want to say it's hard to mess up, but it is a very templated role, and I think he does a decent job of fitting into the role. I don't know if he necessarily makes it his own, but he does feel comfortable there. Rachel Brosnahan is Lois Lane. Nicholas Hoult is Lex Luthor. And then James Gunn, of course, being James Gunn, has managed to dig through the DC archives and pick out, I think, some of the probably less known other characters in the DC universe, which is something he's very good at. I respect his ability to do that. You've got Edie Gathegi as Mr. Terrific, who I think is one of the MVPs of this film. Anthony Kerrigan as Metamorpho. Nathan Fillion as Guy Gardner, who's one of the Green Lanterns. Isabella Merced as Hawkgirl. The cast is also rounded out with Skylar Gisondo, Sarah Sampaio, Maria Gabriela de Feria, Wendell Pierce, and Alan Tudyk. So cast, totally solid. No particular complaints there. I do think I love Nicholas Hoult as an actor. I don't know if I love him as Lex Luthor. I think Lex Luthor is also one of those kind of like hard villains to deal with. I think he's fine in the role, but I'm just like, ooh, I don't know if this needed to be Nicholas Hoult. It didn't not need to be Nicholas Hoult, but I was just like, okay, this is fine. I feel like I've seen Nicholas Hoult stretch more, and some of the trying to cram all of these things into this story and weave in all these extra characters. I feel like Lex Luthor gets a little shortcutted. This film in general, also, I will give credit, I think, to in being like, look, we think you probably already know who Superman is, and we think you already probably know who Lex Luthor is. So we are not going to spend too much time doing an origin story, and I think that was a very smart move because, like I said, we have seen so many iterations of this character, and this isn't supposed to be like a total reinvention of him, right? So plot-wise, this is where I think it benefits from the timing, and again, some of it generally, I'm sure James Gunn was going to be able to comment on, but some of it I was like, ooh, you hit that nail on the head, and I'm sad that this was prescient. There's a very thinly veiled analog for Russia and Ukraine. I don't think that's a huge spoiler. Also, in reality, that could be an analog for any larger power nation versus a smaller power nation. I think a lot of the commentary in this film is very on the nose, but that's also every other Superman. So it's like, all right, well, I'm not going to hold this against you because I do think you are using such a wide vehicle to convey things that if this film had come out maybe 20 years ago, I would have felt like we're a little schmaltzy and antiquated. And now, because this film is coming out now, I feel like are very relevant and good reminders. And I respect James Gunn for saying with his chest, this is an immigrant story. And also, Superman stands for good. You can be good and be from anywhere. There are so many plot points in this that hit harder than they probably originally would have because of the current climate we're in. There's a lot of commentary about journalism and the nature of just perpetual onlineness that was relevant, I'm sure when they were filming this, but now extra relevant. There's the dynamics between leaders. There's all these things that are woven in at a very kind of almost surface level. And I think that, if you look at it as a whole, you're like, yeah, you are trying to accomplish a lot here. And I do think it is successful. I wonder if this film would have been even stronger if we'd gone with a slightly more nuanced approach to some of the topics. But by the same token, looking at the, interwoven nature of evil is also an approach that is very valid. And like I said, because this is such a flagship character and you are taking on this messaging that really, it should be back to the binary good versus evil, right? Like this stuff shouldn't be the rocket science of like, no, really, this is a bad thing. And yet we now live in a world like the darkest timeline where we have to have reminders of this. This is why this Superman is relevant again, which is such a bummer to say, right? So this is where I think good movie elevated by great release timing comes into play. I mentioned, bringing in characters that we don't have preconceived notions about being a really smart move on his part. And then kudos to James Gunn for being able to take secondary or tertiary characters like the lovable sidekick and just turning them into a star. This has been in the trailers. The super dog Crypto in this is the Groot of this film in that people are going to become obsessed with it. A character that we knew very limited stuff about, or you're just like, yeah, cute, it's a dog, in the same way that you're like, oh, Groot is a talking tree and then becomes baby Groot and you're like, this is the greatest thing in the universe. We must protect it with our entire beings. That is what Crypto is going to be. And I think James Gunn knows it and hinged a lot of the movie. I kept going, wow, we are really gambling a lot of portion of this Superman franchise on people loving this dog. And, I think it's going to pay off. I'm not a dog person either. And I was like, I'm still here for this. Now, if you are a Superman super fan, I don't think you're going to be disappointed by this film. I think you're going to have a good time. There are going to be 1,000 Easter eggs that I totally missed in this that you're going to do the Leo point at, and you're going to have a great time. If you are mildly on the fence about Superman and you just have nothing to do this weekend and you want air conditioning, yes, this is a perfectly reasonable and enjoyable watch. I do think it goes a little long, and like I said, the pacing with the flipping back and forth between the comedic stuff and then the earnest stuff, it's a little bumpy, but I still think it's overall an enjoyable film. Now, here is the category that I have been trying to determine whether or not I say run out and go see this film too. If you are not a Superman person, which I am self-identified, not particularly a Superman person, nothing against the guy, but I've already outlined my reasons for why I don't gravitate towards this character, and you're also not necessarily a movie theater person, which I very much identify as a movie theater person, and that's why I've seen the last however many of these films, and also because I'm a critic. But if you fall into this category, I'm not going to say you necessarily have to run out and see this film. I do give it credit in being like, this is not an origin film in the sense of we're going to see Superman land on Earth and we're going to see him come into his powers and all that stuff. Like, this is dumping you in to an existing Superman, which, like I said, I think is a plus for this film. And so as a byproduct of that, this might be more interesting in that you don't have to see the origin story again and again and again. That's something I don't love about the Batman films. We always are seeing his parents being murdered, right? So with this one, they are condensing a lot of things and they are going for it. And I do think it's a good time, but it's not going to change the fundamental DNA of Superman good, everyone else shades of evil. And so if that's just not your thing, I can't make you go see a film, nor am I going to make you go see a film, but I don't know if this is so different from the rest of the Superman formula that I'm going to be like, this is going to make you a convert. So I'm just going to throw that caveat out there. I will say I saw this film at the world premiere, and I was with a ton of first responders who, thank you to the real heroes. In fact, the, James Gunn and co came out to thank them, and they got very misty-eyed at this, and I can completely understand why. And so I think this film does resonate with different audiences in a way that maybe it doesn't resonate with me. And I do think if you are looking for a hopeful film, I said James Gunn definitely infuses this with his sense of humor, but there is not a cynicism to it. And I don't know if there's necessarily a cynicism to all his other films, but he was very mindful about that. So I give him credit there. If you are looking for that, just like, I need hope in this ridiculous world in the form of an alien immigrant, I'd like to remind you, then sure, yes, that could be the swaying case for this. But all things being said, I had a much better time than I was expecting to at this film. It's a very movie theater popcorn eaty film. I'm going to give this a 4.4 out of 5.